Welcome to Book Club Babble. We are live on the Author's Cut, and tonight I am so pleased to welcome Eric Fischl. He's been here before on Book Club Babble, but not on our Author's Cut Live, so welcome back, and congratulations on the release of your second book yesterday, The Trials of Solomon Parker.
Thank you.
Yeah. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the meat of the interview, I just want to go over a few little things that I say every time. So if you have joined us on the Zoom chat, we cannot see or hear you, but you can see or hear us and send us questions through the little chat feature on the bottom of your screen. So please feel free, and I will work them into our interview tonight if you have any questions for Eric. So again, Eric, welcome to our show this fine evening. And I'm so excited for you that you have book number 2 out. So can you just very briefly, we call your books, or you call your books, speculative historical fiction. Can you just say, what are readers going to get when they pick up a book that says speculative historical fiction?
Sure. It's kind of so I'm just going to warn everyone that I'll probably curse a lot during this. So
cool.
if you
go with that.
Ears, then, sorry. So speculative historical fiction is kind of a bullshit title. Basically, these are historical fictions where there are fantastical elements. So, fantasy kind of comes baked in with, dragons and swords and that kind of stuff. There's not dragons and swords, but there's not necessarily just historical fiction. There's other things that happen.
A little bit of magic or mystery, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So give us the quick and dirty on your new book, The Trials of Solomon Parker. Just your elevator pitch.
Sure. So it is a kind of a loosely related follow-up to my first book, which is Dr. Potter's Medicine Show. There are a couple characters from that book, but it's a completely different story. You don't have to read one to read the other.
I can attest to that.
It's a kind of a careful what you wish for type of story. The main character is set in Butte, Montana during the Copper Years, the early part of the 1900s. So Butte was this big industrial mining community back then. And so Saul Parker is working there in the mines, and sorry, this is a very long elevator pitch.
Yeah, it's quite all right.
Yeah. He's made some bad decisions. He's in debt to the wrong sorts of people, and he gets a chance to change things. And so hijinks ensue.
Yes. So let's go right to that, because I think that was a really interesting thing you did. You posed that philosophical question, what would you do if you had a chance to go back and change things? And so I want to ask you, what questions were you exploring through your characters when you set up that opportunity for them? What kinds of things did you want to work with, because that's a pretty big thing. Do we go back and fix it? Do we leave it the way it is? Are we going to make it better? I mean, there's so many pieces to that. And I could just see these threads running through the story where I was like, wow, that's, it's really interesting. And so what were you thinking? What kind of questions were you trying to explore through those characters and this scenario you set up?
Sure. So, a lot of stories where you kind of, there's a time travel element in the story. It's kind of a circular type of a plot. And a lot of those stories, you go back and you change something, and then what's happening then forks out and other things happen, good or bad. The classic example of stepping on the butterfly, and then you get back to your current time and, Hitler won the war or whatever your thing is. But with this one, it was... that kind of circular idea was more kind of when things happen to you, and this isn't even necessarily a time travel changing your type of problems kind of thing. It's when things happen to you, and this was kind of pointed out to me after I'd already cooked through a few drafts by one of my reader friends. These characters one of them is very passive and just trying to make the best of a bad thing. And another character is very active, and he's always trying to change things, and he's fucking it up, whether his own fault or something else that happens to him. And so I kind of like that idea, because bad stuff happens to all of us, and there's you can try to change it. You can make the best of a bad deal and just kind of roll with it. I'm not saying one is better or worse, but I just kind of think it's a fascinating way to move characters through a story and then just kind of also, explore that kind of idea.
Right. And, like it almost seemed like with Solomon, every time he would impact something, it would shift a little bit, but there was almost this thread of fate that was kind of directing similar things to happen. And he was always surrounded by fire, and he was always surrounded by a bit of madness in people in his life. And he was always surrounded by this magical, mystical stuff, and I thought that was really interesting that you kind of, yeah, we can maybe go back and try to fix things, but is there a destiny? Do we have a destiny? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I thought it was a very interesting thing to explore. And the characters, just the way that you shaped them through it. And like you said, you throw them in and see what they'll do. I think that's a cool way to write, and a cool way to explore a topic.
Yeah. So, and there's the other kind of idea, like just kind of like what you said, like he kind of keeps coming back to the same things over and over. And it's, sorry, all these things, when I say them in my head, they sound really corny, but I honestly, this is how I was thinking about it. It's like, you always have times when you're powerless or you feel powerless, right. And you might be trying to, take some agency and do stuff, but world's a tough place. Maybe the world's going to kind of stomp you down into the shape it needs you to be in.
Right.
So,
yeah, it was just, the whole fate versus your own personal free will, and what is just the destiny. Is it trying to shape things a certain way? I don't know. I thought it was really cool. The other thing that was I found really enjoyable about the book was the thread of the folk tale, the Native American folk tale that you had running through the, like sort of through the back of, or parallel. And I read, and I think you said that you didn't use you made this one up, basically based on, a conglomeration of things, or just, you're absorbed in that folklore. And you created the one that you needed. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what's your experience with Native American folklore, and how did you create this one and have it run so neatly next to the story that you were trying to tell with your main characters?
Sure. So, and I think I mentioned this in the written interview piece. So the kind of one of the original ideas for the story, I was reading something about Kennewick Man. The native remains are found in the gorge in Washington, and there was this thing I read that said that, there's a possibility that he actually came from Japan and was related to the modern day Ainu people. And if that was the case, that kind of turns on its head a lot of what we know about how, the Native Americans originally came to North America. Right. I thought that was really interesting. He wasn't, so spoiler alert. Most of what we know, the coming across from Russia and all that kind of stuff is still mostly holds true. But just that little germ of an idea of like, okay, so how do people come to a place, and how do they bring a cosmology with them and their stories, and how do those stories then turn into other stories? Mm-hmm. And so then it got me kind of thinking about, like, a lot of these stories are pretty universal. You have your basic kind of Pandora idea, or, your transgression, you're punished for this type of transgression. And, they're all over the world, and they're largely pretty similar. So that got me thinking. And when I was originally writing this book, I knew I wanted to write a book here in the West, because, again, it was kind of loosely related to Dr. Potter, which happens here in the West, and I live here. So I first started writing it with like Blackfoot stories in mind, because I'm fairly familiar with them just from where I live and all that kind of stuff. And I got about, a third of the way through the first draft and just kind of realized, these aren't my stories to tell. I'm not a Blackfoot. I'm just some dude. So I kind of hemmed and hawed about, what's the right way to approach this, because I wanted these stories, and I thought they needed to be these types of stories because of where it's set. And had I set this in Greece, I could have used tales from ancient Greece, or if I had set it in China or wherever, but this is the West, these are the tales. Right. So instead I tried to kind of anonymize without flattening. So I kind of picked and chose various traditions to make it a generic type of a story without being a particular tribe or actual story. And so I do a little diatribe in the back of the book about pretty much what I just said. And honestly, I don't know if I got it right. Some people I'm sure I'm going to piss off, but that was what I thought was respectful and what I needed to do. So given all that long-winded discussion, the stories kind of evolved in parallel with the story of Saul and Billy. I didn't write a legend and then come up with stories to go around it. One kind of led into the other, and I kind of realized after a few drafts how closely they were entwined. So then it was a matter of kind of tightening them up a little bit.
Yeah, it was. I love when there's that parallel thread happening, and then it's sort of like, you bring it together at the end, and it's like, oh yeah, that's really cool. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. So, you and I were talking, well, in the written interview, we were talking a little bit about how comedy and horror are sort of flip sides of a coin, and I was saying my son is a screenwriting major. Well, now he's film production, but he talks about how horror and comedy, one without the other, or they're really the flip side of each other. And you're a funny guy and you're a very lighthearted person. I from just knowing you, in the little bit that I do know you. And I think, where do these dark seeds come from? Like, where in your universe there are you coming up with this stuff? Because the books are a little bit dark. I mean, they really do dance around the macabre, and they definitely, there's that creep, that really good creep. It works. It's working creep, but where does it come from? And how do you then, what's your, how do you find balance when you're doing that kind of writing? Do you get sucked into that darkness and kind of, or is it just always a story that you're telling and it's not affecting you at all? Or, just let's talk a little bit about writing dark stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I honestly, I am a pretty cheerful individual. And other people I know who write horror or dark stuff, it seems that's kind of the way most of us are. And, I don't always want to just do dark stuff, but I think the stereotype of we're all wearing black and listening to the Sisters of Mercy, and not from the people that I've met, and certainly not myself. But that whole thing about horror and humor being the same thing is super spot on. I went for a run today, and for some reason that popped into my head again, and I was thinking about it. And they all have their roots in uncertainty, like
discomfort.
Yeah, exactly. And something can be a little bit off, and it can be either funny or scary or both. Like, the classic example is a clown. Clowns can be really funny, or they can be Pennywise, because they're just not, it's kind of that, like,
they're a little off.
Thing, right. Or, like when you play peekaboo with a little kid, I mean, this stuff is baked into us when, we're babies. You can play peekaboo with a baby and they think it's hilarious because something is different, but you make the wrong move, make the wrong facial expression, you're doing essentially the same thing, and it freaks them out.
Right.
So anyway, to answer the question about how does one, or how do I divorce myself from dark and horrible stuff? There are certain things that I just cannot write, and I won't write. Like, I cannot do animal cruelty. I can't write it. I can't read it. That's Eric's line.
Yep.
Other stuff, okay. And I think, you're right. You know how this is. You're having to pay attention to so much stuff in a story that it's hard to just suspend disbelief and really deep dive into it, because you're going through and like, oh, the sentence doesn't flow right. This is the wrong word choice. Right. This section really should be somewhere else. So I think there's just kind of a what am I trying to say? A barrier that's already kind of baked into the writing process. But yeah, I mean, my own, reading for pleasure, I love dark and scary and terrible stuff, but I don't go on a diet of it. I can't read 3 Cormac McCarthy books in a row.
No, me either. Good Lord. And so related to that, and I was reading, I don't know if you read John Scalzi's thing that he wrote, his blog post recently about writing today, and that he's finding himself not being quite as productive word count wise, and that his creative energy and just and I was saying to my husband the other day, actually asked me, he said, did you, how's the writing coming? How's the creative writing? And I'm like, it's a slog right now. And it's not that I don't have the ideas. The ideas are there. Things are outlined. But my heart isn't quite there right now. And I think, the world is a lot right now. And are you finding that? Well, so 2 parts. I think we all are affected by it. How does it affect you in your productivity, in your craft, in your day to day, working with what you're trying to do as a writer? And then also, do the experiences of the outside world, do you ever find yourself adapting or changing a story because of something that's happened on the outside? And then you're like, oh, I need to address that somehow in my process, or to process it, I need to address it. And this is how I'm going to do it. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then we'll go to lighter things like what we're both drinking tonight. But it's just hard to ignore that. The things are dark right now. And this is not the first time that they have been in the course of our writing career. This is a particularly bad week, but there have been other really bad weeks. So, you know.
So it's funny because I've had this conversation with other writer friends, and I don't think I'm necessarily an oddball. I think that's a pretty bold. Those people I've talked to, I've been on the other side of things almost exclusively, but I know there are other people out there like me. And what I mean by that is, like, writing is something that is keeping me sane from everything else that's going on. Mm-hmm. And like, I don't have kids running around, or, I've got a nice quiet space, so it's easy for me to just go somewhere else when I'm writing. Right. And so I find that, and I know actually the last, at least year to 2 years have been the most productive I've been for a lot of reasons. But one of those reasons is like, I need a break from the world. So let me go into this horrible dark world of my own. That'll be great.
Yeah.
So, but it's really hard for a lot of people. And honestly, on Monday, that was one of the few days that, like, I don't have it in me, because I'm usually like a write every night for just a little bit kind of guy. But Monday I was like, I just can't do it.
Yeah, I don't have it in me. Yep.
But
how about the outside? Do you ever change what you're writing in response to? So if you're still productive, you still do it, it's your escape. But do you ever find yourself, because I found myself inadvertently doing that a few times, where something's happening and I'm like, I'm addressing it, and I didn't even realize I was, and it sort of detoured my story a little bit, not in a bad way, but actually, it did impact my work. Do you find that at all? If story set already, and you're going with that.
I think it's mostly like, by the time I'm sitting down to actually work on it, it's, fairly baked in my head where it's going. Mm-hmm. But so I don't think it's necessarily changing day to day or week to week, or that I'm aware of anyway, but I'll tell you what, I've got some other projects cooking, and the one that's the most cooked, or one of the two that are the most cooked, I started writing it in, it was March of 2016. So like the political cycle was really heating up, and things were, I don't want to get all political on here, but it was,
it's
tough years.
It's been interesting.
Yeah. So what I wound up, like, I wanted to write a book about, like, so it's a book that's set in the 50s in a slightly alternate history where McCarthyism is even more McCarthy. Like, the Cold War is really cold. And I wanted to write a book about paranoia, and not about that, but I was thinking a lot about paranoia and xenophobia and civil rights going away and all this kind of thing. So the outside world as a whole, like, definitely turned that project into what it is. But I don't think I've really reacted from day to day or week to week.
Right. Yeah. It's just interesting, the things I think that I find myself wanting to explore, now versus just even a few years ago. And I don't know, just curious for writer to writer.
Do you find, can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
so do you find
of course.
you want to make your writing lighter or more positive, or how do you deal with what's going on?
I think I want to have, the struggles tend to get a little bit darker, I think, but I want the outcome to be positive. Like, I want there to be not necessarily a happy ending, because so much will have there's so much trauma in my books anyway, like in war and such, so much will have happened that it's not going to be a happy ending, but I do want that hope, that light of hope at the end. And I do want that thing. Like, I find myself like, I can't wait to get to that part, and I can write that good thing, So but it's just interesting. So tell us about you. Now, I know a few things, but I'll let you, and if you don't cover the ones I want you to talk about, I'll cue you.
All right. Well, what do you want to know?
What do you do when you're not writing? You, I think, have two careers. You're a writer and you're a something else.
Yeah. So my day job is in tech. I manage a technology group for a nonprofit, which is perhaps why I write mostly history, because I'm utterly sick of technology by the time I get home. Yeah. So that's how I pay most of the bills. When I'm not writing, I'm usually obsessively reading. And when I'm not doing that, I'm either cooking or stomping around the woods. We live out here in Montana up against the national forest. So I'm outside as much as I can, hanging out with family, playing with the dogs, that kind of thing.
Yes. So the cooking piece, I asked you about this last year and I said, tell me your favorite recipe. And you said, don't make me say just one, but you did. And it was a good one. And now I've seen some different pictures and such in there. So what would I would say, like in the last month, what's the best thing you've made?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
And if we lived closer, man, I'd be over for dinner. I'm just saying.
There's been a lot of pretty good stuff. I've had some pretty good luck lately. I made this South African piri chicken a little while ago that was really good. It's this, you kind of take a whole chicken and it's covered in a whole grip of peppers and this kind of tangy sauce, and you roast it. That was pretty delicious. This weekend I made a New Mexican adobado pork, which is a pork that you cook for about 5 hours in various ways with this chili puree. That was pretty good. So I've been getting a lot of really good recipes from Milk Street, which is a newish magazine that's been out since January. It's the guy from Cooks Illustrated once he left Cooks Illustrated.
Okay.
And it's a lot of like ethnic-y types of food, but not there for purposes of being ethnic. It's like, here's how this particular type of recipe does this type of cooking style,
right,
well, and that kind of thing. So it's been good just to get some recipes from it. It's been good for like, oh, this is an idea, I can just come up with something kind of based on that. So yeah,
I just handed off all the cooking chores about a year ago to my husband. We've been married for 24 years. And so for 22 of them, I did all the cooking. He traveled, whatever, and just 4 kids. I just did it, and pretty good at it. My mom's Italian, so I have, pretty good repertoire. And finally I was like, hey dude, do you want to do this now? And he's like, I think I do. Now we have all kinds of copper pots that he orders. He's like on the cooking channel. And I'm like, this is so much fun. And it's such an experiment for him. He's like, he's really enjoying exploring, what are all the different spices do and what, and it's really fun. Now I'm like, whoa, what's for dinner tonight? It's very exciting for me. It's not a chore anymore, but anyway, that's awesome. And I think you should write a recipe book at some point in your, in your near future, because I follow along on your Twitter page or wherever you post your pretty pictures of the stuff you're making. And I'm like, really do wish we lived closer. So anyways, you're out in Montana and there's been some fires. And I asked you this in the interview and it was just really interesting, your answer. So I'm going to ask you now, but you've survived those well, and your house is intact and all of your people are good. And fire is a big part of this new book. And I know that obviously you were writing that much earlier than fire season this year, but does that proximity of that fire and the experience with it, did that have any impact on your writing?
This round, no, obviously just from the time frame, but so I wrote this book, started writing it a couple of years ago, and it was another bad fire season. Not nearly as bad as this one, but it was just, fires weren't as close, but it was just socked in with smoke for, I don't know, maybe a month or something. And like, I like to be outside as much as I can. And it's like, I lived in Oregon for 20 odd years and it's always raining in Oregon. So like here it's always sunny and like, it makes me happy and I want to be outside. And I remember riding my bike down to the next little town to go to the library, and I'm like, it won't be too bad. And I got to the library and it was like, I just smoked a pack of Camel Straights. I was just like awful, crabby. I smelled like smoke and my throat hurt. And so there are scenes, one character that starts the book and she comes back a couple other times. She's dealing with that. It's like, she's hot and she's suffering from like postpartum depression and everything smells like smoke and nothing feels clean and it's driving her absolutely
bad. It was so uncomfortable to read this. You did it well. It was so uncomfortable to read those passages in the book. I was just like, I was, like it's hot. I feel sticky. I just want to crawl out of my own skin. So it was very well portrayed. And that's why I asked that. I was like, this is so visceral these scenes. He has to have real experience with this. And then I thought fires, well, it doesn't line up, but it's been fire season before, because it's just, yeah, it's a visceral experience, that kind of thing. And it comes through in the book for sure. So kudos, well done. So another little question, because I think a lot of time when people ask questions of us, via our little sites, always like, what's your process like? When do you write? Are you a morning writer? Are you an evening writer? And then are you an outliner, or do you, how much editing do you do? So just talk a little bit about your your writing process.
Sure.
And then I'll have part two of that, but I'll let you go ahead first.
Okay. I'm well, first and foremost, I'm not an outliner at all. I wish I could be an outliner. It would save me a lot of work, but it just doesn't work for me. And then, it's like we've probably had this discussion in person. I know I've had it with a million people, and I'm sure you have too. It's like half of writing is just figuring out what works for you and throwing the rest away, right? So I don't outline out of the gate. I'll do an outline after a draft or two, just to be able to see on a couple pages what's going on, so I can move stuff around better. But I'm a very obsessive reviser. So I think Solomon Parker had probably at least a dozen full revisions in there. So, and I'm a write a draft, print it out, get a red pen, take a red pen to it, put those changes in when I'm done, rinse and repeat over and over again. So by the time I'm done, I've got a stack of paper about as tall as I am. And I'm not short. So yeah, so that's kind of the way I work through it. I think the things that I'm better at are character type stuff, and it takes me a while to like really get a sense of what the character is. So I think if I started with an outline, knowing from trying that, I don't have a sense of what the character is, and so I don't know how the story's going to go, because I'm not sure how the characters are going to react and all that kind of thing. And I'm definitely a write almost every single day kind of thing when I'm working on a project. So I get home kind of early afternoon or late afternoon, early evening kind of thing, and have dinner, hanging out, that kind of stuff. And if I can get a couple good hours in on a weekday, that's pretty good. And then on the weekends, a couple good days. I don't have a lot of other demands on my time, so I have a lot of free time to write, which is good. But I really need to kind of keep going day after day to get momentum on stuff. But there's some days it's like, it's not working. I don't beat myself up about it. It's like, okay.
How long start to finish for a draft? Like for your first draft, would you say? Because you've done 2 now. So have you gotten more efficient, or this is your timeline? It takes me this long to write 80,000 words.
It's weird, because it's like I wrote the first draft of Dr. Potter in like 6 to 8 weeks, something like that. It was really quick. Actually, really? The small part of the first draft was 6 to 8 weeks.
Wow, impressive.
But then the third thing, it took me like almost a year and a half to write a first draft. Okay. So I was thinking like, okay, yeah, there's more stuff I'm paying attention to, so each draft is going to take longer and longer and longer. Well, then I wanted kind of a palate cleanser after I finished the first draft of this last thing, and so I barfed out another book that it took a month. I mean, it was like, it just fell out. So there goes that kind of trajectory. And then the third thing I've been working on, it's kind of been a pulling teeth one. So it's more back to if I get it done in a year, a draft of it, I'll be happy with it. So short answer is all over the board.
Yeah. Well, that's okay. There's no right answer. It's just interesting to hear what different people's, press. And so do you write at night mostly, and then on the weekends?
Yeah.
All day. Yeah. I have nothing left at night. It's interesting. I used to write at night because when I was working full time, and I would come home and then I would protect that time fiercely. And that now it's, it's different times of the day and whatever. And I'm not as, it's kind of I sort of liked my routine better before, but I like my life better now. So it's all good.
I can edit like over lunchtime at work. If I just have some red pen and a stack of paper, I can do that. But trying to write a draft, just can't do it. I think I need like a running start for my brain to actually get into gear.
Yeah, I hear you. Hey, did you go to Finland this summer?
I did.
How was that?
It was cool. It was a lot of fun. We took a few days on the way out to go to Iceland, and then a few days afterwards we went to Estonia. Nice. It was so this is the third World Con, I guess it was at. And it was definitely different than the other two. There was some logistical things that were a little squirrely. And just like the mix of people were a lot different. There were
Yeah.
lots of, the whole non-English speaking contingent or English speaking contingent coming from a tradition of literature that none of us had any exposure to because we don't know Finnish. Finnish
Right.
science fiction and translation is not
Finnish science fiction and translation is probably not on the top of our list. But anyway, for people that don't know, Worldcon is the biggest science fiction fantasy writers, basically writers and readers convention. So it's not really a Comic Con, it's really a reader writer con, but it's also not it's a unique combination of things. You get to go to workshops, you get to network, but you get to meet lots of other writers, readers, you get to interact with you. So there's some fan stuff, but there's also this real craft developing, and then just science stuff, which is really cool. So yeah, I was just wondering about how Finland was and how did it compare to the stateside ones. That was pretty cool. Yeah, like I finished. Yes, Finnish science fiction. I'm gonna put that on the top of my list in
There we go.
translation.
We need to block your schedule for
Yeah.
Dublin in 2019.
Oh, maybe. All right. So, what is in your pile of books that you have on your desk or your side table that you're reading now?
I am reading so I've read the True History of the Kelly Gang by Peter Carey. I've read probably, this is maybe my fifth or sixth time through it. It's just a book I can pick up whenever, like, oh man, I have, like all my library books came in and I read them and I don't, have got a day and I need something to read.
So I'll read this 10 more times.
Yeah, it's such a great book. I've been kind of geeking out in my own writing about voice stuff, and it's just a fabulous book for voice. So I've been enjoying that a lot more this time around because I've been thinking about it a lot.
Yeah.
I'm reading that. I'm reading a history of the rise of the middle class in Charleston in the 18th century, which is written by Jenny Gilliboy, who is my agent.
Your agent, yes.
She was
Very
nice
cool.
enough to send me that. So that's kind of I think it's interesting, and I'm also using it for research on one of my projects. I just finished yesterday. So I was at the Montana Book Festival this last week, and I met a gentleman from Canada. I think he's in Saskatoon, if I remember correctly. Really nice guy. We had a good chat. His name is David Carpenter, and so it's a book that he just had come out recently called The Gold, which is a story of a guy in England in the 30s who comes to Canada, to northern Alberta, to chase gold, basically. So I read a lot of historical fiction, and it's just a really great book. I highly recommend it. And I also just started reading a book called Criminal Zoo. I'm just a few pages into it, by Sean McDaniel, who I had a reading with. So I picked it up, and we'll see how that one goes.
Cool. Do you read more than one at a time?
Usually I don't. I'll put a couple, 3 books down a week on average, but it's usually kind of a one per. But just the way that, then I read The Ballad of Black Tom a couple days ago. So like a lot of my reading revolves around when my library books show up, and oftentimes they all show up at once. I've got to plow through them.
Oh my goodness, I need to read all of them at the same time.
And they're all new ones, so I've got 2 weeks for each one. So
Yep.
I don't have a stack. Usually I'm kind of winnowing through a couple, 3 others that have been in the pile for a while.
I can only read multiples if they're very different genres, like if it's a nonfiction and then like a sci-fi fantasy, or if it's a a historical something. I might be able to, but otherwise I have to finish one. How about multiple projects? You sound like you work, and this will probably be close to our last question, but you sound like you work on multiple projects at the same time. Do you?
I do, and part of it is, as you well know, there's just such a long incubation period once you actually get a book to someone to read, and then have feedback from that, and then to your agent if you have an agent, and feedback from that, and then when it goes out on submission. And like ideally, I would like to just have a constantly rotating, like, all right, this is sitting there for a while and go back to this next thing. In practice, it hasn't really worked that way until now, and suddenly I have like 3 that I'm kind of working on. But I'm trying to be a little more like, all right, let's just, now that the 2 books that I had contracted for are out in the world and I don't have to do anything with them, let's kind of be a little easier and take more time with these individual ones.
Okay, so now really last question. So you talked a just because I'm curious, but you talked about the one that was the convoluted plot 1950s and took a long time. So what are the other, just give me a little taste of the themes of the other 2.
Okay. The other one that's fairly cooked, or at least it's cooked enough to go out to readers, and I've started to get some feedback, is a couple stories set here in Montana. It's a woman in her 60s remembering back when she was 12. So it's set in between 1938 and 1888, if my math is correct. And things happen, and she's kind of reliving that story. And also things are happening to her in the present tense that is all kind of, I don't know if you can see this, it's all kind of weaving together.
Yes.
So yeah, that's one of the very kind of voicey ones that I was geeking out on. And then the one that I'm working on now is it's 4 different stories that are sets mostly in and around Charleston South, from the kind of early mid 18th century until the 1950s. And it's, yeah, there's several stories, several different voices, and it's driving me absolutely batty because I'm only a third of the way through, and it's just kind of hard to put together at this point. But another 15 minutes.
It'll get there. I know that's like when you can't really see it yet. It's the part, and you swirl and swirl, and finally something breaks through, and you're like, oh, thank God, because I was gonna shoot myself. No, but anyway, it was a pleasure to talk to you tonight. Thank you so much, and congratulations on a really, really fantastic book. I have to say, I said this to you in writing, and when people say it to me, I don't take it as an insult, but I really enjoyed your first book. I really loved the second one. I felt